Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Satellite Communications, Acquiring SATCOM in Tight Times, sponsored by SES Government Solutions on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. I am your host, Jason Miller. Today, our guests are Douglas Lavero, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy at the Defense Department. He's coming to us by phone. Retired Navy Vice Admiral Lyle Bien, Justin Johnson, the Military Legislative Assistant to Congressman Doug Lamborn, and retired Air Force Brigadier General Tip Osterthaler, the President and CEO of SES Government Solutions. So, gentlemen, before break, we heard from Doug some of the things DoD is considering as solutions, at least maybe in the short term, a pilot program in the Air Force. What are some other solutions that maybe are out there? Let me start with Justin from Congressman Lamborn's office. From a Hill perspective, are there solutions that are readily available that you guys are considering?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, last year on the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 14, we worked, my boss, Congressman Lamborn, worked with Congressman Rogers and others who saw this issue and said, you know what, we need to encourage DoD to move in the right direction here. We included language requiring them to come up with a strategy for how to use commercial ComSatcom better. And we didn't prescribe specific solutions. We think folks like SES and Doug and folks in the Pentagon and in industry are the ones who have the ideas and the know how to do this. But just from our limited conversations, there's clearly a variety of ways that you can try and get at this. And Doug just mentioned a few, but we need to basically focus on it. Get smart people thinking about it who have the experience, who can put two and two together and say, how can we buy this better? How can we get our strategy involved so we save money, buy down the risk, and give our warfighters a better service?
Now, what's the deadline on this strategy? Is it 60 days after the passage, 90 days? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's the actual strategy is 90 days after passage. So I think that's end of this month, beginning of next month, and there's supposed to be a briefing that comes over with the president's budget, which came over last week. So now the committees are actually working with the Pentagon right now to schedule that briefing. So it's not intended to be a negative thing. It's intended to help the Pentagon, all parts of the Pentagon, work together on this to buy SATCOM better.
Right. And I'm going to put you on the spot real quick. A hearing, maybe?
We've potential. It's always an option.
Always an option. All right, laid it on the table. All right, let's turn to a tip from SES. From your perspective, what are some solutions to this? We talked cost, we talked risk. What are some things that DoD also maybe should be looking at?
Well, I think what we need to do is find a way that the government and the industry can do a better job of planning together well in advance of need. That's the most important outcome. There are a variety of ways to do that. For the past 40 plus years, the Defense Department has recognized that they won't have sufficient airlifters in the Air Force to fulfill all of their deployment needs when there's a crisis. And so they created a program called the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, which gives them access to civilian airliners to meet their surge requirements and their growth requirements in the future. And they use those assets in peacetime as well. It's a very well-conceived program. It's been very successful. We've thought about it in the space industry for quite a long period of time. We recently, at the urging of some of the people we've been talking to in the Pentagon and on the Hill, several of the satellite company CEOs all traveled out to Scott Air Force Base to learn more about this. And we think it has some potential for how we deal with commercial SATCOM. It wouldn't be the exact same model, but it would give the department potentially access to a large amount of capacity for sort of unanticipated needs at a cost which is affordable. So we're looking at a variety of ways, and the government, to their credit, is out front on these things, trying to find models that will work. We're looking for alternative business models on both sides, and I think we'll find some.
It seems very similar to what you described it as what FEMA did in post-Katrina during the awful storm, that they started to pre-set up some contracts and some suppliers for water or generators or whatever it is. Not that they had to have a warehouse full of them, but knowing that, hey, Polar Spring, whoever it is, I need this many cases of water in this short time frame. Can you turn it around? Okay, now you're on contract. Is that a similar idea?
Well, it's a fair comparison. I think it's a way to streamline the contracting process. You know you're going to have a crisis somewhere, sometime. You don't know where or when. So if you can do things in a contracting sense to speed up that process, then the end users will benefit.
And from your perspective, I mean, is that better than buying on the spot market, because the spot market is a higher cost usually? Is that
well, it's a somewhat somewhat, it's a solution to a different part of the problem.
Okay.
It's not exactly the same. But I think it's going to take a variety of solutions. I think Doug said earlier, there's not going to be a single solution to this problem. We just need to have something better than our current process, which is mostly these short-term contracts. They're expensive, they're a little bit risky, and we need to do better than that, but there won't be a single solution. And we'll still have some short-term contracts.
If there's ever just a need for a silver bullet once in a while, there just never is. That's so
Rarely-
disappointing.
Rarely in a complex problem like this will there be a silver bullet.
Well, and I don't think any problem there. Let me turn to Admiral Bien a little bit. Now, one thing about all these solutions is the pros and cons of commercial versus MILSAT. Give me a sense from your perspective, from your experiences. Is it better to buy commercial? Are there pros and cons to both sides?
I'll certainly address that, your second point. Let me just make one comment regarding potential solutions that DoD could make a contribution to on their own behalf. It's not popular to constrain services to the warfighter, but the fact of the matter is we live every day, and people in uniform live every day living with constrained resources, whether it's the bullets or ships or tanks. Everything that they go to war with is by definition to a certain degree finite. In the case of satellite communications, though, for some reason we have tended to treat that as almost an unlimited resource when in fact we know it's not. So I suggest that there's potential savings by virtue of just disciplining the users and how they ultimately use the service. For example, everybody in this room has a cell phone, and we're operating on a very thin slice of spectrum here in Washington, D.C., and there are probably 400 to 500 users on that little bitty slice of spectrum, and it's done through technology where your words are parsed one at a time to go through the same pipe the other 499 people are using. In the case of the DoD, sometimes they do think business in that way. More often than not, they dedicate a channel. They dedicate spectrum to a given user or a small user population, and in the process, by definition, that spectrum is often lying fallow. So there's lots of opportunities to make better use of the services we have, in addition to finding ways to procure better services. Now, your last point, I think we started here talking about commercial SATCOM and how it differs and what are some of the features. There are a few that I think that really genuinely bear mention in a setting like this. The first is commercial operators like TIPS Company and others who together are launching between 8 and 10 satellites a year. The opportunity for them to infuse technology as each new satellite goes up is times 7 or 8 per year. In the case of DoD, they're lucky if they're launching 1 or 2 satellites a year in the same realm, and they're probably buying them in a block so they can get the best possible price. And as a result, they're launching after some period of time somewhat dated technology as compared to the commercial. The second one is the DoD is fond of saying, and I think it's very accurate, that roughly 50 cents of every space dollar goes into ground terminals. 50% goes into the sexy portion of the constellation, which is the on-orbit segment, and roughly 50% in the ground terminal. In the case of the commercial, because they can amortize the cost of their terminals over so many users, literally thousands, sometimes millions, the cost of those terminals is infinitesimally small compared to that of the DoD, and as a result, the service can be provided at a significantly lesser price. And then I think just in general, the whole idea that you are having to appeal to a very mobile and demanding customer base. So, TIPS customer is everything from a 15-year-old schoolgirl on a campus in San Diego who wants instantaneous communications with her girlfriends to warfighters in Iraq and Afghanistan and everybody in between. If you have a user base like that, like servicing the Super Bowl or the Olympics, that adds up to a very demanding customer that forces you to provide service at an extraordinarily high level of performance. So I would close on kind of where we started, which is what's the risk? If you look at commercial communications as provided from space, the burden of proof on that commercial provider is, I suggest, greater than it is on the government provider, just because he's got a customer base out there that absolutely refuses to have outages, and that represents a high quality of service that the government can take advantage of at a substantially reduced price, perhaps in many cases even more affordable than what they could provide themselves.
Doug, let me turn to you real quick and just give you a chance to kind of talk a little bit about how does DoD deal with that issue of providing satellite communication services all the time, and how to deal with that issue of there's a finite amount, just like tanks and bullets and people.
Sure. Very good, and I think, as Tip mentioned, a very complex problem. It's not a simple thing to talk about. Let me before I answer your question directly, let me add one thing to what Admiral Bien said, Jason. Then I'll turn to your question. You asked about the differences between commercial SATCOM and military SATCOM, and I think Admiral Bien did a good job of outlining sort of the financial differences and the infrastructure differences and the way the services are established differences. The other pertinent difference really is the level of protection that can be acquired through a military satellite communication system versus a commercial satellite communication system. There are some needs within the DoD that the communication must go through no matter what the adversary takes as action. Those kind of protected services will always go ahead and be provided by a military satellite system, because it's just not economically feasible for a commercial provider to go ahead and provide those services. But the bulk of our services, the 80 to 90% of our services, really have protection and reliability requirements similar to what Admiral Bien talked about. We want that high quality of service. We want that high level of service, and the commercial world, as he said, is in a good position to provide those. Let me now turn to the question of, well, what about those unused channels and the capability that might not be being used to 100% efficiency? That's true, but it's hard to go ahead and determine on a minute-by-minute basis exactly when you will need a satellite communication channel. And it's not quite as simple as the setup and takedown of a cell phone call. In fact, the fact that you have 400,000, 500,000, a million, 4 million users within the D.C. area, you can do a statistical analysis and say how many of them will be on at any one time, and you can go ahead and start to provide bandwidth to them on a statistical basis. When you only have one set of forces in the Horn of Africa, and those forces may or may not be involved in a specific operation that will require very high bandwidth for 10 hours a day, but have no bandwidth requirements the rest of the time, it's not like you can hand off that bandwidth to somebody else. That's got to be there for whenever the so-called balloon goes up, and they have to launch that UAV or send the soft forces into combat. And it's not a statistically able to be modeled situation. So the most of our services fall somewhere between those ends, right? The statistically modeled service where there's going to be some people on at all times, and we can just average, and the other kind of service, which is we have no idea when it's going to start, when it's going to end, and it must be available immediately upon start and end. And so we can do some of that averaging that Admiral Bien talked about, but probably not to the same extent that we do cell phone or TV service within the U.S.
All right, good points. Now we're getting towards the end of the conversation here. So let me turn to Justin Johnson from Congressman Lamborn's office. Short-term, long-term changes from your perspective of the Hill, what's needed?
Well, I think we took the first step in encouraging DoD to send us this strategy. I think our goal is not to, prescribe solutions or tell the Pentagon or the industry what to do, but is to make sure that they're working together as closely as possible. I think these pilot programs are great, and we are eager to see the results of them, and hope that that's just the first step towards many more, not necessarily even in the same vein, but many more attempts to try creative solutions to solve this problem in a way that provides better services for the warfighter and uses every penny as best as possible.
Tip, from your perspective in industry, short-term, long-term changes you could see?
We're seeing some of the short-term changes right now. I think Justin has just outlined some hopeful ones. I think for the long term, these alternative business models like Pathfinder that we've talked about are promising. Some implementation of the Civil Reserve Air Fleet model might be promising. My final point I would make is this is not easy. When thinking about these issues, I'm mindful of the fact that in 2008, there was a GAO report. For those who are engaged in this discussion now, it might be useful to go back and read it. If you didn't read the date on the cover, you would think it was a summary of this conversation. So it's just a reminder that when you have an acquisition process which is embedded in thousands of pages of federal acquisition regulations and defense implementation regulations, change is very, very hard. The senior leadership commitment that we've seen on the Hill is very promising. The level of commitment of people like Mr. Lavero is also very encouraging, but this is a lot harder than it looks. We've been at it for a very long time. We've made very little progress. So it's going to take a lot of commitment over a sustained period of time to really change things.
The old analogy of turning the battleship goes slowly. We're going to turn to Admiral Bien. I'm guessing you may have some experience with that.
Well, aircraft carriers more than battleships, but I get the point. Four things that I think we could concentrate on that would make life better for both parties. One is budget the money. We've been dealing for the last decade plus by buying commercial SATCOM with supplementals. The supplementals are drying up, and now where do you get the continuing funding? So that needs to be formalized. Two is government needs to buy at a predictable rate. Boards of directors have fiduciary responsibilities. They're not going to invest in the building of high-tech, high-priced commercial satellites unless they have some reasonable expectation that the service will be procured. Two is be clear on requirements. Government is, for reasons that I've never completely understood, is reticent to look their commercial partner in the eye and say, you know, if you would build the following qualities into your satellite, that would please us. They are reluctant to have that conversation because for some reason they think it's an implied contract, when in fact the commercial builders would relish that kind of a dialogue, and I think it's doable. It just means getting over the reluctance to engage. And then the last point is be a good partner. Nations around the world have found ways to partner in very significant ways with their industry and their government in ways that profit both segments. In this country, it's a little bit harder. We have public law that makes that a little bit difficult, but I don't see why 3- and 4-star generals and admirals can't sit down with people like TIP and their companies and really act in good faith as a partner with and stop short of implied contracts, but really have a dialogue that will make that he will be able to provide a better service, and they will, as a result, be better customers. I think those are doable, both in the short run and over the long term. And if we did just those simple things, I think we would the need for this kind of a discussion in a decade from now would be substantially less.
All right, and Doug, you get the last word, about 30 seconds or less.
All right. Well, thanks, Jason. Well, listen, everybody's made great points on both the short-term and long-term things. I think they're all absolutely valid. Let me say this: we are committed to solving this problem. This is not just a problem for making sure the warfighter has the communication he needs. We have to solve it for that. This is also a budget problem, as we spoke about. Both of those are reasons that we need to go out and do it. There are important Pathfinder work that's going to be going on in the next year. I am 100% confident we will go ahead and get through this because we've got great industry partners and we've got the right folks within the DoD who are focused on trying to get this done. This is the time to make the progress, and I think we're committed to doing it.
Thank you, sir. Now, this was a fascinating conversation, but that is all the time we have for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Satellite Communications, Acquiring SATCOM in Tight Times, sponsored by SES Government Solutions on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. Our guests today were Douglas Lavero, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy at the Defense Department, retired Navy Vice Admiral Laurel Bien, Justin Johnson, the Military Legislative Assistant to Congressman Doug Lamborn, and retired Air Force Brigadier General Tip Osterthaler, the President and CEO of SES Government Solutions. If you missed any portion of this show, you can listen to the show in its entirety or on demand at federalnewsradio.com, keyword SES.
On behalf of SES Government Solutions and our media hosts, thanks to Jason and the panel for this informative discussion. You'll be presented with some polling questions as you leave the webinar to help us improve future sessions. We appreciate your feedback. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate for this webinar should receive it in the next 2 weeks. Be sure to register for upcoming webinars from WTOP, Federal News Radio, and Fed Insider. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.